Vietnam, it should be in Vietnam. Okay. So just like we found the supply side data, so look at so if you go to the SEI file, if you now extend, right? You already found that information, so that works. And if you extend the next 3 lines, that should work also. Okay? Everything that we took out, we are now able to bring back. Okay. This is the little bit of the real sector that we are thinking about, how to think, where to get all the information about output growth. Okay. This is in real terms from the supply side, and so this sheet here, NSO RSSA, is data from the NSO, real supply side, annual data. Quarterly data is also available from the NSO, not exactly the way we took it down, but you have to collect the data from individual files that are at different places. I have some of that data, and for those of you who need it, I can show you where that data, the real GDP data comes from, quarterly data. Quarterly data is not available in a consistent form going back. So one has to make some adjustments to the quarterly data, to the old series, using the new series, but that can be done. And you will see that when we start doing aggregate supply analysis on the next lecture. Just as we found out the real side, we can also find out the nominal data. This is GDP of Vietnam in nominal this should not be constant prices. This should be real prices at current prices. Okay, so if you once again go back to the NSO website, remember there was a whole list of tables down there, and you picked out one table. So on the NSO website, if you go to national income accounts, you were able to pick up gross domestic product at constant 2010 prices, because that's real GDP. If you want data at current prices, you would pick it up from here. This is from the supply side. If you want the data from the demand side, you would go here.
Expenditure.
Gross domestic product by expenditure category at constant 2010 prices, real GDP, and at current prices, nominal GDP. So these 4 locations will give you that data. If you're looking for other pieces of information, then you can see that you can collect some more. But this is all annual data for output. This is not quarterly data. Okay? Good? Okay. All of that data is collected in the macro framework, the NSO real supply side, NSO real demand side data, NSO RDDA. The next blue one is NSO NDDA nominal demand annual, and NSO NSS is nominal supply side annual. I just want to show you a little bit. When you collect the data from the demand side, NSO RDD, and you process it in this sheet, this is quite a big sheet in some ways, but I want to sort of notice that the top part of the data here, many of these things are from the NSO. Okay? So you will find real GDP from the NSO. And the real GDP in 2010 will be exactly the same as it is from the supply side, and will be exactly the same as nominal GDP, because we are using the prices of the base year 2010. So nominal and real GDP in 2010 will be exactly the same. But after that, nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP, because there is inflation in Vietnam, and when you calculate real GDP at current prices, your nominal GDP will be higher than your real GDP. And this is the situation if there is inflation in the case of Vietnam. So some of this data I want you to look at, find out where some of these numbers are coming from. You will notice that the real GDP is coming from the NSO. The final consumption expenditure is coming from the NSO. The private consumption and public consumption is coming from the NSO. The gross capital formation is coming from the NSO. The change in inventories and the gross fixed capital formation is coming from the NSO. The net exports is coming from the NSO. And the statistical discrepancy is coming from the NSO. Okay. And if you click on any of these yellow cells, it will basically take you to the NSO RDD. This is the data that you will pull down from the NSO. The NSO provides information on real GDP from the demand side. It provides total GDP, final consumption broken down into, so final consumption is what? C. Final consumption state is CG. Final consumption household is CP. The gross capital formation is the total amount of investment in the economy, I. The gross capital formation, fixed capital formation is machinery, investment, infrastructure, but that is not broken down into private investment and public investment by the NSO. The inventories that we were talking about, change in stocks, is here. And finally, we have the X minus M, but we don't have X separately and we don't have M separately. And because the data from the demand side and the supply side do not fully match up, you have to put in a category which is statistical discrepancy to make the GDP from the demand side and the supply side become equal. In some years, the discrepancy is positive. In some years, the discrepancy is negative. In some years, the discrepancy is small. In some years, the discrepancy is quite large. The statistical discrepancy essentially says, I could not measure the size of the pipe correctly. Therefore, the size of the pipe is different, but it should be the same. So I just put in a number to make the size of the pipe in the circular flow of income exactly the same. So given that we do not have some categories of demand from the NSO, where does all of this other information come from? The remaining green cells. Okay. First, look at the exports and imports. Okay. Look at that number. In 2022, exports of goods and non-factor services. You notice that it is not coming from the NSO. It is coming from somewhere else. So let's find out where it's coming from. So stay with me and track this number. Let's track the number for 2024. Okay, it's 8138. Where is that number coming from? It's coming from somewhere below here. Let's go down to that number. Right, 8138 here. But where is this number coming from? It is coming from two numbers. Right? It's coming from exports of goods and non-factor services in billions of US dollars. And it's coming from a number which is the exchange rate. Because we are not getting the data from the NSO, but we can go to the external sector accounts. Because if the external sector accounts have information on exports of goods and non-factor services, we can use that information. The only thing is we need to convert it into VND. The information in the balance of payments is in US dollars, and if we can find an exchange rate from somewhere, then we should be able to calculate the exports of goods and non-factor services. So, here we are trying to get an idea of GDP from the demand side, and it's C plus I plus where C is, let's include both X minus M. Let's forget about the statistical discrepancy for now. And we have private sector consumption plus government consumption plus private sector investment plus government investment plus X minus M. We have this from the NSO. We have this from the NSO. And we have this from the NSO. We have this from the NSO. We have this from the NSO, but we don't have this and this. We can't separate them up because we have the total number. And we are not able to separate X from M. But if we can get this from the balance of payments, right, then we have this, we can find this, or we can also find this from the balance of payments. If we can find this number from the budget or from the fiscal sector, if we have this and we have this, we can find this out. Budget, fiscal. And this is what is being done here. Because we don't have the exports and imports separately from the NSO, we can form an estimate of the exports and imports of goods and services from the balance of payments. But where does the exchange rate data come from? We can either get it from the SPV or we can go to the IMF. We because the IMF publishes data on the exchange rate of all of its member countries. Okay, so let's first do the easy part, which is the exchange rate. The exchange rate for Vietnam for 2024, the average for the period was 24,165 VND per US dollar. So the State Bank of Vietnam collects the data on the exchange rate day by day by day. It collects some kind of an average for the year, and then it reports it to the IMF. And then the IMF publishes that information on its website. So this number, 24,165, if I try to look for it where it came from, it tells me that I got it from another sheet, which is my global sheet. And in that global sheet, that's the number, and that's a number that I get from the IMF. I will show you in a couple of seconds where that number comes from the IMF. Let's first look at the balance of payments. So on the demand side, where is that number? What number was I trying to track? Yeah. Okay. I was trying to track this 8133. 8133 comes from here. It comes from the exchange rate, and it comes from the exports of goods and non-factor services. I've tracked the exchange rate, and I need to track now this number. Okay. Remember that this is real exports of goods and services. The balance of payments will only give you the nominal exports of goods and services, because the balance of payments is calculated at current prices. It is not calculated at constant prices. So I have to take the number in current prices and deflate it by some index of export prices. To go from a nominal number to a real number, I always have to deflate it by some deflator. The nominal numbers I can get from the State Bank of Vietnam, because the State Bank of Vietnam publishes data on the balance of payments. And it does that on a quarterly basis. So you can get the balance of payments for Vietnam from the State Bank of Vietnam on a quarterly basis. Would you like to see how to do it? Or do you want to go home tonight and do it yourself?
Just give it the look. Give it the look.
You want to see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this is the real exports of goods and non-factor services. This is the export price index, 128.1. The export price index can be obtained from the National Statistics Office. The National Statistics Office actually publishes an index of some NSO, National Statistics Office. NSO publishes an index of export prices, which is rather sort of unusual, but it does. Okay? So we can collect information from different pieces, but the interesting thing to keep in mind here is that we are now able to link the real sector to the external sector. We said there were linkages among the sectors, and we are able to use and exploit those linkages to complete our macro framework. Okay? So we are able to go from the external sector, use deflators from this source, use exchange rate data to actually calculate, to complete the national income account, picture in the national income accounts of the various components of demand. Okay? So, the exports of, so where did this nominal number come from? 336.8. It is telling me to go to the balance of payments. And once I do that, I all of a sudden find myself in Vietnam's balance of payments. Right? And where is that number? That number is here. And where did this number come from?
Something above 2.
It comes from the exports of goods
State
plus the exports of services.
balance of payment. Export.
And where did those numbers come from? Okay. So let's look at the exports of goods and ask where that number came from. And that number comes from a sheet called SB, State Bank of Vietnam BOP. Here. Where did that number come from? Okay, we can find that out also.
Other banking.
That number comes from the sum of 4 numbers. And what are those numbers? Is the exports of Vietnam in quarter 1 plus quarter 2 plus quarter 3 plus quarter 4. And this information that I'm showing you here comes from the SED. So in that sheet, in the SPV BOP sheet, on the top left, there is a link to the State Bank of Vietnam. Now this is in Vietnamese. My Vietnamese is not very good. So I am going to go to English,
Statistical.
and I can go to statistical data, and I can go to balance of payments. This is the data for the second quarter of 2025. We hide now 2025. Okay, and if you want to get the data for some other time period, you can go down here and you can locate the data for the other quarters as well. You can download an Excel file. So for example, if I do 1/1/2024 to 9, let's say October, I say 31 October 2025. It will let me choose the data, the Excel file. But notice that for some quarters you have multiple files. That's because the SPV first published this data, then revised it, and then revised it. So this is the final data for the third quarter of 2024. For the first quarter of 2025, there was a first estimate, which was then revised, and this is the latest estimate for the first quarter of 2025. Okay? Good. So for example, I can download this Excel file and it will give me, actually it gives it to you in Vietnamese. Okay, this is the second quarter balance of payments and it has all the categories that you're looking for. So if you're planning to do some research on the balance of payments on a quarterly basis, this is where you would collect all the data.
So we need to export one by one and combine them.
Sorry?
We export one by one data.
You have to export one by one, and then, but in the file that I gave you, I've already collected the data for many, many quarters.
Yeah, yeah.
In that SPV BOP, because some of the older data might not be available, but if you're doing research, you should clean up that particular sheet. Also, some of the data might not be consistent because the way the data is put together is done on the basis of a balance of payments manual, which is published by the IMF, and they sometimes change the way the data is to be collected. It used to be the balance of payments manual 5, then became the balance of payments manual 6. So they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 balance of payments manuals, and sometimes the categories are changed, sometimes the names are changed, sometimes the way the data, the basis of the collection of the data can also change. But as a first approximation, if you want high frequency data for the balance of payments for Vietnam, I think this is the only place to go. The IMF will have data on the balance of payments for Vietnam, but on an annual basis. And some of that might be a bit different. So if you need to do high frequency analysis, that's the place to go look for the data. There's a couple of other places on the NSO's website where you can collect data on exports and imports by different, more bigger sort of breakdown into different kinds of exports and imports. But then again, you have to collect the data month by month by month. It's not on a consolidated basis, consistent basis over time. Okay. So we figured out how to do this. We figured out how to do this for the balance of payments. The only thing that's left is, can we find out public investment, and for that we need to go to the fiscal accounts. Remember again that the fiscal accounts are done on a current price basis. And if you want to convert it into real quantities, you have to use some kind of a deflator.
Yeah.
So let's look at current prices. The issue of the deflator is something that, you know, is a little bit more complicated. So let me go to domestic demand, nominal domestic demand. And you can see that in the NDDA sheet, we've been able to break down real GDP into its different component parts. In particular, we have a line on public investment. This is the line that we're looking for. We're looking for public investment. Okay. Let's see where the number for 2024 came from. Okay. It's coming from two numbers.
Fiscal. And as well.
This is a little complicated. Okay, you can go home and explore a bit. The basic idea is that in the fiscal accounts, and let me show you the fiscal accounts now. So go to the sheet towards the right, which says fiscal. Here is the fiscal data on the government of Vietnam, which is some of it is collected from the Ministry of Finance. The later data is collected from the Ministry of Finance, but some of it is collected from before when I was working at the IMF and some of it later. So what does the fiscal accounts look like? Well, just as we said, in the fiscal accounts, you first need to say what are the taxes that the government is collecting. Right? We have the VAT. VAT when you go buy your lunch at the canteen, domestic VAT, VAT on imports when it comes from outside to Vietnam, corporate income tax, personal income tax, PIT, excise duties which are taxes on production, other trade taxes which are import and export duties. Then we have other kinds of taxes, and then we have the non-taxes, which is fees, that you have to pay because you have to register your motorcycle. These are grants that the government of Vietnam receives from outside. On the expenditure side, we have current non-interest expenditures, wages and salaries, purchase of goods and services, plumber, fixing the toilet is here. Then you have interest payments on domestic debt, on external debt, and you have capital expenditures, which is the IG that we're looking for. Isn't that right? That's roughly what we're looking for. It may not exactly be the same here because this is the central government. What we're looking for here is public investment as a whole by the general government and other parts of the public sector. But we can use this as an approximation, and we can take this number and use it in the national income accounts. So once again, you see that some information that we did not have in the national income accounts, we're able to use the idea that the accounts are interrelated, that the fiscal sector is related to the national income accounts, we use the idea that the balance of payments and related national income accounts to fill some of the gaps in the information that we could not find from the NSO. Okay?
I
So
see.
that's roughly what we have been trying to do.
Mhm.
Okay? I will leave you to go home and look at some of this information. I just want to show you a simple chart where we look at the revenues and expenditures of the government of Vietnam over the years. Most of the time, the Vietnamese government has run budget deficits. The budget deficit became large during COVID, but there were large budget deficits here as well. A second thing to notice here is that revenues first increased, but then they started falling. Why is that? This is an economy that's growing. Unless you reduce your tax rate or you don't tax some things that you used to tax before, your revenues should roughly stay the same or be increasing because you become more efficient at collecting taxes. The reason, one of the reasons, at least one of the more important reasons why these taxes are falling is Vietnam has entered into free trade agreements with many, many countries. So goods from those countries come free of import duties into Vietnam. So essentially goods that you were taxing before, you're not taxing them now. And you can see that, I think you can see that, when you go to the fiscal accounts and you look at the taxes as a percentage of GDP, look at the line on trade taxes. Taxes on imports used to be 1.7, 1.9% of GDP. As Vietnam has entered into free trade agreements, that number has dropped down to only 0.8% of GDP. So you have a decline of almost 1% of GDP in revenues, which is quite substantial. But that's fine. Vietnam is entering into free trade agreements with other countries. The trade system is becoming more and more liberal. Things are becoming cheaper for people in Vietnam, and that's what Vietnam has chosen to do. And in 2024, the VAT also looks very small, but this may be revised up. This number looks really small. So this kind of a spreadsheet where you take the numbers, so the numbers on the top are taken from the Ministry of Finance, because the Ministry of Finance publishes some of this information. Some of this other information you have to collect and piece from various other bits. Then you analyze it by converting into percent of GDP to see what things are rising, what things are falling, and what is happening to fiscal policy, and what is happening to the budget deficit. Okay? Clear? I know it's a lot of information to process in one day, but when you go home and you sleep a little bit and wake up tomorrow, some of it will start making sense. It's a lot of information for one day. This is the kind of thing that's done in a week, 10 days, but okay. We also said that the public debt of Vietnam is important because it is an obligation of the government of Vietnam to pay back. It's an obligation of the government has borrowed the money, it has borrowed it from inside, it's borrowed it from outside, and the government needs to pay the debt. Vietnam's public debt situation is quite good. Okay. Public debt is at about 25% of GDP. And for countries like Vietnam, which are emerging market economies, the number that's usually stated is 45 to 50%. So So the level of public debt as a percentage of GDP is right now quite comfortable. Which means that Vietnam has fiscal space, that it has the ability to run some deficits and increase its public debt if it needs to support the economy. Countries which have very high levels of debt will face a difficulty because the debt level is already high. It is harder for them to borrow, and it's harder for them to borrow and repay. So a low level of public debt, plus the fact that some of this debt is at quite concessional interest rates, makes the fiscal situation in Vietnam generally quite okay. Let's now look at the final sector, which again is a little bit difficult to get data on. And the data on the monetary sector is not published by the SPV. Or let me put it this way, I can't find it in the English language. So if we go to the SPV website, will you look at it and see if you see any data that relates to the monetary survey? Can we go there? You can help me find out. Is there anywhere in Vietnamese that you see any reference to monetary survey data or monetary aggregates on this website in Vietnamese? Can you take, sorry? Monetary aggregates, monetary survey, something like that? Hmm? No, I don't want to change because the Vietnamese website is different from the English website. Because some people, I think I had some students or somebody, they found out that the information that's available in Vietnamese is more than the information that's available in English. Not everything on the Vietnamese is translated into English, I think. Okay, so if you're looking for information on interest rates, nice one, that's here. I don't know what this is.
Reserves.
Or what? Reserve requirements. Financial literacy. Digital literacy. But there is no, can you see anywhere in the data if there is any information on balance sheets of commercial banks, monetary survey? Do you see anything? There's only a little bit of information on credit to the private sector, but not too much more information on monetary aggregates. Okay? So unless you get the information directly from the SPV, it is very hard to construct a monetary survey for Vietnam. So all of the data that you find in this file is data that I have from before, that was received, but basically confidential information. Anyway, it's historical. Now, some of this data up till 2023 November, monetary sector data was published on the IMF website. And after that, the data on the monetary survey is not available on the IMF website. Okay? So if you go to this sheet here, IMF monetary, all of the information here is from the IMF website. So just as I said, member countries have a responsibility to provide information to the IMF because they are members of the IMF, so that the data can be used to analyze what is happening in the economy. As part of that responsibility, the State Bank of Vietnam submitted this data to the IMF, but that data stopped in November of 2023. And data after November 2023 is not available on the IMF website. Okay? And this data is available on a month-by-month basis. Okay? So if you need to do some analysis on some aspects of the monetary sector, on money growth on a quarterly basis, some of that data is available from the IMF website, but until November of 2023. Data on some parts of the monetary survey. Remember when we did the monetary survey here, we said we have net foreign assets of the State Bank of Vietnam, net foreign assets of the commercial banks, and then we have net domestic assets, NDA of the commercial banks, we have NDA of the State Bank of Vietnam. There is data again that Vietnam has to provide to the IMF on its international reserves. There is a relationship between international reserves and net foreign assets. So you can use that relationship between net foreign assets and international reserves to create a little bit of information, some bit of the monetary survey. You can use the data from the State Bank of Vietnam's website to find out what credit to the private sector is. You can use some data from the balance of payments to find out what is happening to the net foreign assets of the commercial banks. You can use fiscal data to find out how much the government has been borrowing from the banking sector. Okay. Not fully, but somewhat. So you can piece together a little bit of information from the real sector, a little bit of information from the external sector, a little bit of information from the IMF, a little bit of the balance of payments to construct a monetary survey for Vietnam. Okay. So after all of these things are done, the monetary survey for Vietnam looks something like this. And what do we have in this monetary survey? Just as I said, on the asset side of the balance sheet, we have the foreign assets. We have the foreign assets of the State Bank of Vietnam, SBV. We have the foreign assets, foreign liabilities. The difference of those two is the foreign assets, net. We have the foreign assets of the commercial banks, banking institutions, foreign assets and foreign liabilities. If you remember, I had made this balance sheet. Which had the asset side and the liability side. On the asset side, we said we have net foreign assets, and that has to include the foreign assets of the central bank of the country, STB, and of the commercial banks. And on the asset side, we also have their foreign assets and domestic assets, net. So it has to be net credit to the government, because this is the borrowing of the government. It is an asset for the commercial banks and the SPV if the government borrows from them. The banks also make loans or they give credit to the private sector. Right? And then there are other items next. So we have domestic credit, the borrowing by the government, net gross borrowing by the government minus the deposits of the government, which makes it net. The central bank lending to the government, how much it lent minus the deposits of the government at the central bank, how much loans the banks have made to the private sector, credit to the private sector, other items. And then on the liability side, we said we need to have broad money. And in broad money, we have currency in circulation. This is the currency, the VND, that are printed by the State Bank of Vietnam and that are outside the State Bank of Vietnam, currency in circulation. And the other part is the deposits of the private sector in demand deposits, time deposits in the, right? Because the deposits of the government, we already brought them here. So these are the deposits of the private sector, you and me, and the companies in the commercial banks. Because a deposit, your deposit in the bank is your asset, but it is an obligation of the commercial bank to pay you, so it's a liability of the commercial bank to you. So it has to be on the liability side. So the one question? Currency in circulation in the economy. You know what it looks like? The cash. This is currency in circulation. It's money that's printed, that's sitting in my pocket, that's in your purse. This is currency in circulation. The money in the bank accounts is not currency in circulation. It's just an entry in the bank book which says the bank needs to pay you 10 million VND because you deposit 10 million VND. That's the deposit. But that's not currency in circulation. The currency in circulation is this. Right? The deposits are your bank account with Vietcom Bank, your bank account with Vietchin Bank, your bank account with ACB or whatever. So the monetary survey of a country looks like this. The monetary survey of Vietnam looks like this. And once we have that information, we can ask ourselves we can analyze it a little bit to ask questions in terms of how rapid is the growth of broad money? How rapid is the growth of credit to the private sector? That's important and useful information. You heard about the money multiplier probably in your courses before, in introductory, and you heard about the velocity of money.
Velocity.
And then there are some other analytical categories that we can construct to see why broad money is increasing. If broad money is increasing because this is a balance sheet, either NFA is increasing or NDA is increasing. if the central bank goes to the foreign exchange market and picks up that $100, which was extra in the foreign exchange market, how does the central bank pick up that $100? It issues VND. The way the central bank can get those $100 that you have, that you want to give up, it has to give you VND. So the central bank's foreign assets go up, but at the same time, it has issued currency in circulation to buy that foreign exchange. So if something happens on this side, something will happen on this side. It's a balance sheet. If a bank makes a loan to a business, how does a bank make a loan to a business? It signs a contract and says, I will give you 1 billion VND. So this number goes up because the bank just made a loan to the business. But it does that by making a deposit of 1 billion VND in the name of that business. So whenever credit is created in the economy or loans are generated in the economy, it leads to an increase in deposits, which can then be spent, but an increase in deposits leads to an increase in broad money. So increases in broad money come from increases in net foreign assets and net domestic assets. If the government borrows from the commercial banks, right, the banks have to, how does the government borrow from the commercial banks? Vietcom Bank has to say, okay, the government, I make an account of the government, and the government can borrow, and the government spends the money. But Vietcom Bank has given a loan to the government, and in the process, it has created deposits and created money. And finally, we can say how much of the broad money creation was because of net foreign assets, or how much of it was because of domestic assets being created. Did broad money grow because we got a lot in the current account surplus, a lot in international reserves from outside, or was it because there was a lot of credit created in the economy? Did the banks give a lot of loans? If the banks give a lot of loans, then NDA will contribute to broad money growth. If a lot of foreign exchange comes into the economy, it will lead to broad money growth. This is a distribution of broad money growth, whether it's coming because of foreign exchange coming into the economy, excess foreign exchange that's picked up by the SPV or the commercial banks, or is it because banks are creating a lot of loans, or is it because the government is borrowing too much? So in a sense, the monetary sector is capturing what is happening in the balance of payments. It's capturing what's happening in the fiscal sector. It's capturing what is happening in terms of investment in the economy, because if a lot of credit is being created, businesses are taking a lot of loans, what are they doing with those loans? They must be making investments, or they must be hiring people. So the amount of activity going on in the economy in some senses is related to how much people are borrowing from the banks to conduct business. So the monetary sector collects a lot of information from all of the other sectors in the economy, which is the idea that we started with. So we've now looked at all the four sectors: real sector, balance of payments, fiscal sector, and the monetary sector. And I want you to keep this particular picture in mind when you go to sleep tonight. This is a useful picture. It tells you that you can think about an economy in terms of these four sectors. You can collect data on these four sectors. And if you are able to analyze that data, it can give you quite a bit of information about what is happening in the economy. And that the data that you collect on the different sectors is related. So if you have some missing information here, you can use the information somewhere else to put together a fuller picture. Okay? I have another 20 minutes. What I'll do is I will not start a new lecture today. It's too late. But it's fine. I'm happy I think we've gone through quite a bit. I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of what it is that we're going to do from now on. Remember, at some point of time we were saying this. We were doing this. We were saying, in the context of fiscal deficit, we were saying that there's just a deficit, but at the same time, to get a good measure of whether fiscal policy is helping the economy, not helping the economy, how much is helping the economy, it's helping too much, too little. We need to construct other measures of the fiscal deficit. But to construct those other measures of the fiscal deficit, we need to first construct this line.
Potential.
Right? The only way we can get E star and R star is if we know this line. And this is the line of potential output. Okay? Potential output is something, or what is the capacity of the economy to produce. So we are going to, next week, start thinking in terms of potential output, right? And we'll do it in very, very simple ways. No complicated, just a simple HP filter. We know HP filters have problems, but that's fine. Okay? So we are going to look at some ways of constructing this particular line and trying to measure the output gap. When output is above potential, the output gap is positive. The economy is operating above full capacity. If actual output is below potential output, the output gap is negative. The economy is operating below potential. When the economy is operating below potential, then policy should help the economy, push the economy to produce more. There is room for monetary policy and fiscal policy. If the economy is producing above capacity, then policies have to put the brakes on the economy. Monetary policy and fiscal policy needs to be tight. Okay, so we're going to do that. We will look at the issue of growth accounting. If the economy is growing over long periods of time, how do we, why is the growth taking place? Capital is growing, labor is growing. We'll do a simple solo accounting, something that you might have already seen. Everybody, you must have seen the solo model as part of your, right? So we'll use simple Vietnamese data to see whether we can do a solo decomposition of growth. And then we'll look at aggregate demand. We'll decompose the various components of output, and that's something that hopefully we should finish by the morning of the next, when we meet next on Tuesday. I will then, we said that in the real sector we want to look at output and inflation, and then I would like to look at some aspects of inflation, seasonal adjustment, decomposition of inflation. Is it coming from this source or that source? I will take you to the NSO's website, again, pull down some data on inflation prices and how to think about a little bit about inflation, core inflation, underlying inflation, so on and so forth. And after that is done, we will start thinking in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy and how to think about whether fiscal policy is too tight or too loose, what is fiscal policy doing in the economy, what it should be doing in the economy, did it do the right thing when it was doing something, and similarly for monetary policy. Let me stop here today and let you go.
Thank you.
Talking a little bit early, but that's it's okay. How do you say it? Được rồi.
Được rồi.
Good.